Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to my show, the Daniel Perez Podcast. Our guest today is Pastor Peter Aviles. He has been a pastor for many decades, as well as a professor of church and ministry leadership at Trinity College. Thank you for joining us today, Pastor.
I'm glad to be here.
So, for today's topic is about politics and the government. So, as we see, for a few weeks, the president has led the United States military into a war against the Iranian dictatorship, and a fair number of people are supporting the government while others are against this war. Even Christians and churches are divided about the support and the government. When it comes to politics, we are a divided country. So my question for you, Pastor. So the question is not really about the war, but I was kind of wondering, what does Jesus and the Bible have to say about our role or our relationship to the government and to politics?
Well, thank you for inviting me. I'll answer the question directly. The scriptures does not provide an exhaustive teaching on the relationship about Christ in politics and Christ in government. It's not a long, in-depth teaching on this. Yet, there are several key interactions that Jesus had that were written that can shed some light and give us some understanding of what he was thinking.
Exactly.
So, in addition, we have one of his closest disciples, and there were a few of them. Peter had lots of times to hear Jesus' thoughts and teachings that were not recorded. And I'm believing that what Peter wrote in his letter provides additional insight on perhaps some of the conversations that he overheard Jesus to have. And so there are several key verses that come to my mind when it comes to perhaps Jesus in politics, Jesus in government. First in Mark chapter 12, then in John chapter 18, 1 Peter 2, as well as Romans 13. And I really believe that, particularly in Mark chapter 12, Jesus lays a foundation that influences our view about politics and the government. And so if you don't mind, I want to read that little paragraph.
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
Okay. So this is Mark chapter 12, verse 13 through 17. It says there, later they sent some of the Pharisees and Herodians to Jesus to catch him in his words. They came to him and said, "Teacher, we know that you are a man of integrity. You aren't swayed by others because you pay no attention to who they are, but you teach the way of God in accordance with the truth. Is it right to pay imperial tax to Caesar or not? Should we pay or shouldn't we?" But Jesus knew their hypocrisy. "Why are you trying to trap me?" he asked. "Bring me a denarius and let me look at it." They brought him the coin, and he asked them, "Whose image is this? Whose inscription?" "Caesar," they replied. Then Jesus said to them, "Give back to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's." I really believe that verse 17 lays a foundation of not only Jesus' view, but what can be called our view about government and politics, especially in that phrase, "Give back to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's."
I've heard those words before, of Jesus many times before. What does it mean, actually, besides paying taxes? What more could Jesus have meant?
Well, there's several things that are revealed in that, and that single phrase, and other scriptures shed light on it. So let me jump into this right away. Well, you know what? I need to give a little. I have to digress a little bit.
All right, go ahead.
From what I read, Jesus was being set up as a trap. They were trying to see if Jesus would take one side or the other. Meaning, would he take the government side, which would result in the Jewish people being angry with him? Or would he take the side of the Jewish people, causing the government to be opposed to him. So they were trying to set him up in a trap, to try to get him to decide one way or another, to pick one side. Would Jesus go against politics, or would Jesus be counter politics, or would he be against the world? What side would Jesus choose? And that backdrop can shed some light on this phrase, give unto Caesar's, that kind of thing.
Okay. That was very interesting. But what does it mean by give back to Caesar what is Caesar's and to God what is God's?
Okay. All right. You have to forgive me because I do digressions. I'll come back to the question. So let me get back to the question.
Yes, Pastor.
There are at least three things that I understand of what it means to give to Caesar's what is Caesar's, and that's where I want to focus on. The first you already mentioned, which is about taxes. Okay.
We all love taxes.
Yeah. And the three things I'm going to mention all have to do what we owe. The scriptures uses that expression, owe, what we owe the government.
Exactly.
And our duty to the government. So give unto Caesar is about what we owe the government. And Jesus is supporting that. And the first one is, yes, pay your taxes. Paul wrote a little bit about that in Romans chapter 13, verse 7. He says, give to everyone what you owe them. If you owe taxes, pay taxes. If revenue, then revenue. So most people don't like paying taxes. In Jesus' days, the tax collectors were hated because many of them were crooked, corrupted, greedy, and overcharged people.
And we still see that today.
Yeah. And in our days, just in a couple of weeks, April 15th is coming, which is in the United States, that's the day when by then you have to submit your tax returns. And a few people, after they submit it, they might get some money back. But there are some other people, when they fill out their forms, they're going to realize that they owe the government taxes. Let me just say this first thing about you owe. Give unto Caesar what is Caesar's. Yes, the first thing is pay your taxes. We owe that to the government. Secondly, the government is also due submission. Now, remember I told you about Peter? He was one of Jesus' disciples. An interesting verse in John chapter 21, who was another disciple of Jesus. He said, if we were try to document everything that Jesus ever did, and I would add everything that Jesus ever taught. If we would try, there isn't enough room in the world to put all the information of what Jesus did, and I want to add what Jesus taught. But so therefore, even John could not write everything, but he had an understanding of all the things. Well, Peter was one of those also who was close to Jesus. And I believe that there are some hints that we can get from his letters about what it means in terms of what we owe the government. And this is what Peter wrote. In 1 Peter chapter 2, he said, submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human authority, whether to the emperor as the supreme authority or to governors. Some of that is also identified in Romans 13. Okay, I told you I was going to take a digression. I got to take a digression here. When Jesus was communicating this, and when Peter was communicating this several decades later, the Roman government was over the entire Middle East.
Okay.
And they oppressed people. They were cruel to people. They were not a good government to the other nations around them. So when Jesus or Peter says, submit to the emperor's government, that is a corrupt, evil, wicked, abusive government. I want to say that because sometimes it makes it easy. We say, the government, it's easy to submit to when the government's nice, when the government's good. when the political leaders are great. It's a different thing when they're not that. And here, in the second point I'm trying to make, where you submit to authority, that is communicated in the midst of a very evil, corrupt political government. And so the word submit means to voluntarily subject oneself to another. And it's not a coercive obedience, it's not a forced submission, but it's a willingness to voluntarily you yield yourself to another. Think about this. Jesus did not ever disobey the Roman government. There's never, anyone could never point to anything that Jesus ever did that was flawed, sinful, rebellious, counter the government. We can't find that. Even when Jesus was in a trial before Pontius Pilate says, I find no fault in this man. And so, submit to the government and to the laws of the land is a second thing that is applied to give to Caesar's what is Caesar's.
Okay. So, other question. How far is a Christian to submit to the government? Is there a limit to obedience?
That's a good question. And I want to give you an answer to that, but let's put that off for a second. Let me finish my final point in terms of what it means to give to Caesar's what is Caesar's, okay? And I'll get to that question. Okay. So Jesus taught this thing about give to Caesar's for Caesar's. One more thing. The government is due honor. So far I mentioned the government is due taxes, the government is due submission, the government is also due honor. Again, let's see what Peter said in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 17. Show proper respect to everyone. Love the family of believers. Fear God, and here's the phrase, honor the emperor. Now remember, I told you, the emperor was not a good guy. He was not. But he's saying honor, which simply means to show proper respect, to give proper homage to another. Honor recognizes and respects that God places people in government, and even the government, the present political leaders, he orchestrates, as hard as that to accept, God is sovereign. He permits, he allows, he orchestrates the governments and the political people who are in power. And personally, I don't like some of them, but God is ever sovereign and operating and working that way. So people in the United States, I give you an example. People in the United States right now, some people really hate the president. Some people really love the president. But some people who hate the president honor, here's that word, honor. They honor the office. So irregardless of who's in the office, they're going to honor the president because he holds that office. All believers in churches are to submit and honor God, of course, as they submit and honor the government and the rulers. And therefore God has said, honor, show respect, show homage to those in authority. And as Peter said, even to the emperor. So those are the three things that come out from this: give unto Caesar's what is Caesar, what is due, what is owed.
Exactly. Okay, so why we must submit and honor governments and leaders who are wicked, cruel, corrupt, etc. What biblical reasons are there why we are to submit and honor the government, besides that Jesus said so?
Yeah, why do it? I like listing things in threes, so I talked about three things here. So let me give you three reasons. And the Bible itself identifies why. Why should we honor, submit, when like you said, the government can be very corrupted? Here are the three reasons. Three reasons that God says. Number one, because God has established all authority, all government authority. That's hard to accept. What God has, even the evil governments that are killing and oppressing people? Romans 13, 1 and 2, Paul, think about it, the book of Romans, written to the Romans who are on the Christian Romans who are under this oppressive government. Paul is writing to them and telling them this is how you need to relate to this government. And he says every ruler, from the emperor down to the governor, city magistrates, are all in positions of authority. Here it goes. Because God providentially appointed them to that position.
Wow.
Yeah, that's just, really? Okay. Jesus, I want to get back to something Jesus said. And he was having a conversation at his own trial. And Pontius Pilate said this statement to Jesus. This is John chapter 19. Pilate said, "Don't you realize I have power either to free you or to crucify you?" And Jesus answered, "You have no power over me if it were not given to you from above." In other words, Pilate, you're in this position because from above, God appointed you to that position. You don't have any power over me. God has appointed you to rule and do this. And so we take this understanding that we submit because we believe God in his sovereign hand is allowing those leaders and those governments to be in place, as evil and as wicked they may be. Now, this doesn't mean that God is happy in terms of how they're ruling, because some of them don't rule very well, and there are leaders in the world who are influenced by Satan. So again, it doesn't mean that God is content and satisfied with what they're doing. But he still says, submit and honor them. I said I like working with three, so let me give you the second one. Why do we submit? Because God, the government that's there, it dispenses justice for evildoers as well as for law-abiding people. It dispenses justice. And that's also, again, found in Romans 13 and 1 Peter chapter 2. Governors, it says, governors and other politicians are sent by God to distribute justice to all. To the ones who are good, to the ones who do wrong. They're there, they have a sword, they're there to correct, they're there to distribute corrections where it needs to be corrected. The law is to be honored, and they're supposed to enforce the law and to treat fairly those who are innocent and to bring justice to those who are not. So why do we follow or honor is because God has placed them to attribute, to bring about corrections and fairness to those who are righteous. In other words, if we want to live a peaceful life, then we should not be lawbreakers, because then we'll experience that punishment that would come.
Oh, wow, Jose. How's it going, man? Everything good? All right, you want to sit down and grab a mic and just join the podcast? All right, people, we got Jose in the building.
Hello. Okay, I just overheard you guys talking, and I was wondering what you guys are discussing today.
All right, so to my listening podcast audience, my good friend Jose Polo just walked into my live show. Jose, so we're discussing Jesus' view on politics and government. We were in the middle of discussing the reasons why are we to submit and honor government and political leaders.
Oh, okay, that sounds very interesting. Can I join you guys for this podcast?
Sure. Pastor Peter, this is my friend Jose. Can you continue your explanation on reasons why Jesus taught people to submit and honor political leaders in world governments?
Okay. Glad you're joining us, Jose. So the final, remember I told three things. The final thing is the reason why we submit to government is because by submitting and by honoring, we give witness to the gospel. We give witness to God. In 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 5, it says this, "For it is God's will that by doing good, you should silence the arrogant talk of foolish people." Now, many Christians and churches alike have given Christ a bad name. There are many believers and churches that have lived hypocritical lives, engaging in immorality and injustice, and and the world has seen that. And as a result, maybe justly so, the world and the community can get very critical and dislike Christians, dislike the church, and so forth. However, when believers truly, and churches truly say, no, I'm going to live as God called me to live, which includes I'm going to submit to the government, that, by the way, not only oppresses and treats Christians badly, it just does it to all people. When non-believers see Christians honoring God in their submission, honoring God in their respect that they give, honoring God that way, it impresses them, the non-believers, about the genuineness of the Christian faith. And so Peter's writing, he says, when you do this, when you live this way, it kind of quiets down the criticism of the arrogant because you're walking the walk. And that's the third reason why we submit to and honor the government or even politicians and so forth. So that's my third reason.
Okay, but wait a minute. I have a question regarding that statement that you just said. So what if the rulers are wicked, and what if they're abusive? What if the government is also abusive, corrupt? What if they're unjust? So do we also have to submit to those governments in that case?
Yeah, that is the question I asked at the beginning of our discussion. Is there some limit to the extent that Christians submit and honor political leaders and world governments?
Well, let me get to that. So your question again is there a limit to submission? Is there, perhaps another way, is there a limit to obedience to political leaders in government, right? That's what I'm hearing.
Yeah.
So let me give you a direct answer. Is there a limit? The answer is yes, there is a limit. Just want to be very direct. There is a limit. The Bible has limits to the extent that of how we believers submit to them. And so the principle is kind of saying, when do we say no to the government? Or when do we resist? What's the guiding principles? And here it is. I'm just going to read it because I prepared this ahead of time. Whenever the local or the national laws are enacted which contradict God's laws, okay, God's law, then civil disobedience becomes a Christian duty. I want to repeat that because I want whenever the government and the national, they put laws that contradict God's word, God's law, okay, then it is our civil duty to be disobedient. We call it civil disobedience. So there is a limit, and it's led by what He commands. I'll give you a couple examples. When there was like civil disobedience. You know the story in the Old Testament. Pharaoh, he created a law that said, kill all the babies, especially the male babies, right? Exactly. That's Jewish, kill them all. That was law. And the midwives were supposed to kill them. And they disobeyed. They would not kill them. Because that's a taking of a life that they weren't going to do that. Another example of civil disobedience was Daniel and his friends. They were in a country where the king set up an idol of himself, and he said, "Everybody must bow down and worship me." That's contrary to God's law, right? And so Daniel's friends, they would not bow down. That is civil disobedience. That's going against a law that was from the government. I'll just give you one more. Peter and John were going about preaching the gospel because God commanded them to preach the gospel. They were arrested, and the religious leaders and the others were saying, "You have to stop preaching the gospel." And they refused to do that because God commanded them to preach the gospel. So, in other words, our loyalty is first to God. That's it. We are to submit to authorities only right up to the point when obedience to the government would entail disobedience to God. Or I'm going to read this and then I think we're coming close to the end. If the government commands what God forbids, or if the government forbids what God commands, then our plain Christian duty is to resist, not to submit, to disobey the government in order to obey God. Okay?
Wow.
That's the limit.
So basically, our time is coming to an end, right? Thank you for sharing what Jesus taught about the extent we submit and honor political leaders and the government.
I was wondering, you get a brief moment for one more story? Does your time podcast cuts short, or?
Sure, I have a few minutes before I have to end this podcast, so go ahead.
Are you okay with that too?
Yeah,
Okay.
sure.
I don't know. I was born and raised in Chicago, and I grew up as a Democrat. I think everybody in Chicago is like loyal Democrats. Okay, and that city is called the Windy City. It has nothing to do with the weather. It's not because the wind blows. It's called the Windy City because the politicians, they talk. They just talk all the time. Smack, whatever you want to call it. It's a very politically driven city. And then later on, when I became, as a teenager, a Christian later on, I began to be more familiar with the Republicans' views of politics and so forth. And as a result, I was being pulled, go on one side or go on the other side, go here, go there, and people were asking me to take sides. I've heard people take sides in politics. Some say I'm Democrat, some say I'm Republican, some say I'm socialist, some say I'm libertarian, some say I'm conservative, some say I'm liberal. You know, people are taking sides all over the place. And I've heard people pray, "Oh Lord, you know, judge them, you know, come down," you know, asking God to come down on a different political party and so forth. I've heard things like that. And so I was challenged as a young man, what side am I going to be on? And then one day, as I was wrestling with this, the Lord really impressed upon something on my life. And so I'll ask you the question. Jose, do you want to know what side God is on?
Yeah, does God have a side in all this?
Okay. All right. Regarding that, one day I was reading scripture, and I felt like the Lord was speaking to me in a passage in the Bible. And it's the story of Joshua. Joshua, he's getting the people ready for a battle. There in front of Jericho, God had given them some instructions. They were ready to fight. The Lord is guiding them to that particular battle. And I would have think that Joshua felt we're on God's side. We're on the right side. And it says this in Joshua chapter 5. Now, when Joshua was near Jericho, he looked up, and he saw a man standing in front of him with a drawn sword in his hand. Joshua went up to him and asked, check this out, Jose, "Are you for us or for our enemies?" In other words, Joshua encountered this angel. Well, some people think it's God in human form. Let's just say it's an angel. And do you hear Joshua's question? He is saying, in a sense, he's saying, are you on our political side or are you on their political side? Are you for us? Are you for our enemy? What side are you on? And people ask that all the time. Are you conservative? Are you liberal? Are you this or you that? What side are you on? And I want you to hear what the angel's response is to that question. Verse 14, this is his response. Neither.
Wow.
He replied, he said, neither. But as commander of the army of the Lord, I have come now. Then Joshua fell face down to the ground in reverence and asked, what message does the Lord have for us? So Daniel, saying, God is not on one side, political side or another. He is not for one government and then therefore against another government. Jesus is not on one side, or one side of the aisle for politics. Even when Israel, the nation of Israel, fell into immorality and idolatry, God came against them. Okay? God is not on one side or the other. The question should not be, God, are you for us? Should not God be on our side? That should not be the question. The question we should ask is, are we on God's side? That's totally different. Are we on his side? And so when I think about that, is it okay? Can I talk to the audience here? Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Stay right here. We're having fun with this little podcasting, but I wanted to just say that fundamentally, our hearts should always be asking, are we on God's side on any issue? Are we following what the Lord calls us to be? I think about someone becoming a citizen of this nation. Once they pass everything and they go through all the procedures, one of the last things they have to do is they have to pledge allegiance to the American flag, right? And pledge allegiance to the government here. Well, the Lord is saying, look, I must be supreme in your life. Do you pledge your allegiance to me? That's what the Lord says. And it should be that way. If in anything that the government ever asks us to contradict God, we should say no to the government and yes to God, because we're on God's side in all things. And I just want to challenge everyone who's listening and watching this is to ask yourself, are you on God's side? Not what political side. Are you on God's side? Fundamentally, that's what it should be. Let's pray. We're going to end here.